Hey you guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. Today I want to talk to you about the 3 biggest mistakes that I see anglers make in the winter time and what you can do to change it. Winter bass fishing has so much opportunity. There are giant bass caught this time of year all over the country. It's an amazing time to be on the water, but it's also uncomfortable. And as a result, a lot of people shy away from it, especially if they're not catching fish. You should be out there. Winter is absolute prime time. I actually like winter as much or more than I like spring, because for the most part, it's an empty lake. And when you get bites, they're big bites. Now, with that said, there are some key things. There are some common mistakes people make that are brutal. They will ruin your chances. And today I want to cover the 3 most common and how you can adjust to avoid those. The number 1 mistake that I see people make this time of year is wanting to stay warm. And what I mean by that is not sitting at home, right? And obviously, there are some guys sitting at home, watching fishing on TV, watching it on YouTube. Those guys aren't catching fish. But there's a lot of guys fishing in the wintertime, but they pick their conditions. So they fish, days like this, although this is misleading. It's freezing cold out here, but the nicer days. But even that's not really what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is that most guys get to the lake well after the sun is up and it's starting to warm, and then they fish the warmest part of the day and then they go home. Now, there are fish to be caught that will work. You can do that for the rest of your life and catch bass. But if you're that guy who just never seems to tangle with the big ones in winter like the ones you hear about, it's literally timing. You're trying to stay too warm. No one wants to freeze. No one likes being that cold. But giant bass love to feed during low light periods when the water temperature is cold. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of why that is, because frankly, it would be conjecture. I don't know why it is. I just know that it is. There is a period of time in the morning. There's a period of time in the evening. If you've got cloud cover or a storm or fog, that can stretch out. But those low light periods, that's when the giants bite. It's amazing how consistent that has been in my own fishing through the years. I mean, there's been times where Tim and I are crushing giant fish day after day after day, and we're talking to buddies that just are not catching them, and it's driving them crazy. And when we finally sit down and compare notes, they're not even on the water during the hours that we're catching the fish. It's that key. So get uncomfortable this year. Change your timing. Instead of eating breakfast at the restaurant on the way to the lake, just go fishing and then go get some lunch on the way home from the lake. Now, it won't work every time, but that low light, I'm telling you, in my opinion, what's going on is the colder that water gets, those fish, they want to maximize their opportunities. They want to move as little as possible. So lower light gives them better ambush opportunities. They're more likely to be successful. That's what I think it is. Now, for the guy who's still, maybe you live too far from the lake, you're just not willing to get up that early. Banks like what I'm sitting on here now. See this dark bank? I mean, it's already, the sun is up, it's shining, temperatures are starting to rise, but you've still got dark banks. Once that sun is coming up, focus on those darker banks, because that can make a really big difference for you as well. It's still low light. You can still catch bigger fish on those banks throughout the day. The second thing, I would say probably the number 2 mistake that I see is guys trying to fish comfortably in their actual fishing. And what I mean is that they stick with their same old baits. They fish things they're comfortable with. This is not new. We have talked about this before. Guys are afraid to branch out. So if you're not catching fish, your core response, the thing that the average angler does, is go to their safest baits, if you will, right? So a guy will pick up a shaky head or the jig he caught him on all summer. or a creature bait, those mid-sized, comfortable baits that a guy has the most confidence in. The problem is winter is a different animal and it needs to be treated differently. So when things aren't going right and you reach for those safe baits, you're not actually reaching for safe baits. You're reaching for tough opportunities. It's going to be tougher fishing when you do that. This is the time that you should focus on fishing the extremes. What I mean by that is go bigger, go smaller, go faster, go slower. And we'll get to that slower stuff in a minute. That's its own category. That's what we're going to wrap it up with. But talking about these extremes, you can go bigger or smaller. Let's start on the small side. Let's go there. I love to throw, you know, oh, we got some wind blowing. Hopefully it doesn't interfere with the camera for you. We've got, you know, a 4.3, a 4.8 Kitech, a bigger Largo shad. I love throwing those mid-sized swim baits. I throw a lot of that stuff throughout the year, but when it gets truly cold, I'll slow it down to a crawl and I either go bigger or smaller with those soft baits. So like when I'm talking swim baits, this is as subtle as I get. This is a Megabass Spark Shad. That's the 3-inch Spark Shad on a guppy head. This bait has such a subtle action and it works in the coldest water. I mean the coldest water, just barely creeping and crawling that thing on the bottom and just bumping it into those things, and those fish will pick it off way better than they were, say, a 4 or 5-inch swim bait. Just by going smaller, I'm getting more bites. But the same thing can be said for going the other direction. You guys see us throwing a lot of the big stuff, right? An 8-inch Magadraft. I'm more likely to throw the 8-inch than the 6-inch this time of year. Now, I also throw that S-Waver 168 a ton. You guys have seen us catching big ones on that lately. That's not an accident. I'm intentionally going larger. Just like I'm intentionally going smaller and slowing that thing down and just creepy crawling it on the bottom, I'm intentionally going larger so that the meal is worth it for those fish. So they are more likely to commit and run that thing down and eat it. Now, on the speed side, 2 more thoughts for you. You know, we've got to talk about the speed cranking thing because it is a thing. Even in the coldest water, you can get fish to react and chase and feed at unbelievable speeds. But again, it's about the extremes. If I'm going slow, I'm going slower than slow. And if I'm going fast, I'm going as fast as I can go. So speed cranking, that's that Tactical DD75. I'm throwing that on an 8-to-1, even when the water is in the high 30s and low 40s. An 8-to-1 reel, turning that handle as fast as I can, but I'm burning and stopping. Burn, 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 pause. Burn, 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 pause. Burn, burn, pause. To cause those fish to chase, and then when I pause, to run into it and to lash out and eat that thing. But that's very effective. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, wow, it's really starting to blow. On the other end of the spectrum, slowing down, I'm gonna slow all the way down. You know, I said a shaky head or a creature bait. You're not gonna see me do any of that. If I'm going small, I'm going small. I'm going all the way down to the Ned rig, finesse TRD, very little action. It's all profile, just sitting on the bottom and just barely moving that thing. Now, one tip for you, and we've talked about this once or twice in the past. We've all seen the chartreuse heads hanging on the pegs at the tackle shop, and a lot of guys are like, what are those for? This is that time of year for me. I love to throw the purples on my Ned rig this time of year, but if you get a big storm, muddy water starts coming in the lake, you'll immediately see me go to a chartreuse head on that thing, and then I just soak it, just barely move that thing. Those fish can find it. They are remarkable at that. So again, number 1, stop trying to be so warm. Get out there, fish low light, fish during the times where the big fish are eating. Number 2, don't fish those comfortable baits. Branch out, fish the extremes. Go bigger, go smaller, go really fast, go really slow. Don't go anywhere in the middle. Now, the third mistake I see has everything to do with movement. And I don't mean a speed crank versus crawling on the bottom. What I mean is that guys, they get these comfortable modes. So like when you shake a shaky head, that one guy will just shake that thing, right? The other guy just sort of pulls it. We get in these modes where we have a favorite way to fish a bait. Too much movement is a killer in the winter. The colder the water gets. Now, if you're on some power plant lake somewhere, more power to you. Catch those fish. But if you're not, if your water's cold, too much movement is an absolute game ender. You can literally blank around fish just by moving your worm too much, because nothing in the water has this big, exaggerated, over the top, big Kitech tail kicking. Nothing is doing that in that really cold water. Everything is subtle movement, minimal movement, unless it's running for its life, right? Trying to get away from something. So you can apply that to a lot of different baits. The first place to apply that, let me show you a major difference. So this is my summertime A-rig. This is our standard tactical flex rig, okay? 4.8 Kitechs, great big dummy baits on there, overall very large profile. This is our mini flex, significantly smaller overall, significantly smaller, but it's all about the baits. This time of year, I get away from that, the Kitech Fat Swing Impact, like the #1 swim bait in the world, right? I get away from that this time of year. The colder the water gets, the more you're going to see me go to slimmer profile baits with minimal tail movement. That is key. This is a G-Rat Slim Swim. I've been crushing them on this thing lately. And then on top, these are Kitechs for my dummies. So I've got 3 dummies, 3 hooked baits, but these are easy shiners, not the Fat Swing Impact. Much tighter action. So I use those easy shiners on top, tight action, not a lot of movement, it's just profile. And then I put those baits down below with a bolder color, those thin swims, nice tight tail kick. It's not that big exaggerated thing on a smaller rig, and I get way more bites just by minimizing the amount of movement on the rig itself. And we're working on taking that to the extreme. More on that in the coming weeks, but there is room for growth there. Going to subtle baits, there's those 2 baits. Going to those subtle baits makes a huge, huge difference. The jerk bait, another prime example. We've all got a cadence we like. For me, I throw that jerk bait out there, I get it down a little bit, and then rip, 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 wind that up. Rip, wind that up. Rip, rip, rip. That's like my springtime cadence. Rip, 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 pause. Rip, pause. This time of year, we're gonna slow that down to bump. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, bump. Go 5 again. Let's try 3. Bump, bump, bump. It's not these giant rips, and it's not doing it over and over and over again. I'm slowing that cadence down. I'll go all the way to a 10 count between my rips. And that's when the specific jerkbait becomes critical. That Vision 110 +1 Junior, that's my favorite bait this time of year for doing that slow motion. Because if you fish a bait that's not very well balanced and you're doing a 10 count, it's either rising or sinking. And depending on your water temp, these can as well. They're not perfect at every water temp, but you can adjust them. But just straight out of the package, that is your best bet for that just slow pop, pop, and then just let it sit there. Soaking that bait in front of those fish, there's a reason for it. The colder that water gets, fish tend, in most lakes, to hold to cover. They'll hold to bottom. When you work that jerkbait over them on a fast retrieve, they might nose up to look at it, but it's already taken off. But if you work it and then let it sit, they have time to rise up to have a look, and then the next time you move it, they attack because they're in close proximity to it. Going too quickly, they just never even get into a strike zone situation. Same thing with a blade bait. You know, the blade bait, you can fish a blade bait like a lipless crankbait, but this time of year, we're barely fluttering that thing. And I mean, the Demiki Vault, that Megabass Dyna Response, both amazing baits. Harder thump, more subtle thump, but it's not even about the thump. It's just about how little I pull it. The second I feel it flutter, I kill that thing. If you're pulling that thing like you were in the fall transition, it's not the same deal. The water temps have dropped. The fish have become more lethargic. Slow work that thing, and you'll find a major difference. Then one more example is the jig. With the jig, probably the biggest thing is I go to a double tail grub. The double tail grub, that's a 5-inch Yamamoto, but a double tail grub, especially if it's soft like this, will have very, very subtle movement, even if you're just pulling the jig on the bottom. Those summertime trailers that you use, you know, baits that have big arms that'll kick, as the water gets colder, that plastic gets stiffer, and a lot of those baits stop moving. The claws don't work in the really cold water. So going to a double tail grub, they'll still have very subtle movement, and you can just barely inch that jig along. There's subtle differences, right? Just fish an hour earlier. Throw something a little bigger or a little smaller, and then pay attention to your retrieve. You can do everything else right and come out there and be fast working that jig, and you're just not catching them. Pay attention to those subtle little nuances. These are some of our absolute favorite baits to throw this time of year, and I'll link all this stuff in the video description for you. But even if you're throwing something else, just focus on those subtle details, and it will make a major difference for you all the way through winter as we head into spring. Guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll talk to you soon.